Firstly, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Gaya Sriskanthan. I'm a climate activist who's worked on climate, tropical forests, and indigenous rights, and on building locally owned renewable energy. I am more than honored to have been invited to chair this discussion with the inspiring poet and activist, Nnimmo Bassey. It's really hard to do Nnimmo's long and radical history of fighting for social and environmental justice in a simple biography. In the 1990s, he co-founded the Nigerian Environmental Rights Action, which is known as the Nigerian chapter of Friends of the Earth, to advocate, educate, and organize around environmental human rights issues in Nigeria. Nnimmo, along with Environmental Rights Action, led Oil Watch Africa since 2006, and then led the Oil Watch International, working to mobilize communities against the expansion of fossil fuel extraction across Africa and internationally. He also served as chair of Friends of the Earth International. In 2011, he founded the ecological think tank, Health of Mother Earth Foundation, and he was the recipient of the Right Livelihood Award in 2010 for his work to reveal the full ecological and human horrors of oil production, and for his work to strengthen the environmental movement in Nigeria and globally. I know that Nnimmo is also very humble, but I think it's really important to know his history. As the mainstream climate movement, particularly in the global north, is only just embracing the idea that climate justice is important, it's also important to remember that environmental activists from the global south have always made the connection between human rights, economic justice, and the environment and the climate. Whether it's indigenous people being murdered for defending the forests, or fishers and farmers defending their precious food production systems and their own livelihoods from oil pollution. So we have much to learn from Nnimmo, who's been on the front line trying to stop the oil industry for decades. And today we'll get the chance to discuss with him the implications of the recent UN climate talks in Glasgow for the region of Africa. So for the first half of our session, I'll be in conversation with Nnimmo to discuss his perspectives and experience of the climate talk process, what it materially means to communities in Africa. And then we'll move on to questions from the floor. So please do put your questions in the Q&A tab on Zoom as we go along, and I'll draw from those to ask Nnimmo later on. So Nnimmo, welcome. Let's get started. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and experience with us today. Maybe we can start with you grounding us in why COP26, or the climate talks that happened in Glasgow at the end of last year, from your perspective, was a failure, and what that means for communities on the ground in Africa.
Thank you so much, Gaya, and thanks to the Oxford Farmers Conference for setting up this conversation. The Conference of Parties 26 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that held in Glasgow was really a very big failure, although governments and some observers wish to look for ways to color it as something that was just one of the things on the highway to having climate change tackled. The truth is that the COP process actually started to fail many years before Glasgow. To me, the major and fundamental derailing occurred at the conference that took place in Copenhagen in 2009. That was when emissions reduction were now made to become, emission reduction became voluntary for polluters, for states to act on. Before that time, states were either grouped as Annex 1 or non-Annex 1 countries. In other words, Annex 1 countries were the industrialized nations who have had very high levels of contribution of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere historically and currently. And such countries were required to cut emissions at certain levels in line with their polluting levels. This was based largely on science. And we should note that when we talk about temperature increase these days, we always use the industrial, we also pre-industrial levels. So the Industrial Revolution is the kind of baseline for measuring the harm that the release of global greenhouse gases to the atmosphere have brought into the entire climate scenario. So in 2015, the Paris Agreement consolidated the voluntary emission reduction pattern that was introduced in Copenhagen. And the major item on the Paris Agreement is that countries should nationally determine what contributions they will make to emission reduction. And this is the shocking thing. Before COP26 took off, the aggregation of the nationally determined contributions suggested by various governments showed that temperature increase would be in the range of 2.7 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels if countries do what they said they were going to do, what they volunteered to do. During the conference itself in Glasgow, there were more pledges that were brought in. Perhaps the scandal of the 2.7 degrees temperature increase above pre-industrial level was so much that some countries brought in some new pledges. And what happened was that when these pledges were assessed, then it now meant that we may be looking at a temperature increase of 2.4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by the turn of the century. Now, that may sound something less than 2.7, but it's nothing to care about for Africa. And I'm saying this because temperature increases, whether 1.5, which is the best that the Paris Agreement looked out for, or well below, so-called well below 2 degrees, or whether 2.7 or 2.4, we are speaking about global averages. And Africa is known to experience temperature increases at about 50% above the global average. What this means that even if you look at the best scenario from the Paris Agreement, which is just a mere guesstimate of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, Africa will be having 2.25 degrees. So the minimum, the best scenario in the world is still a catastrophic level for Africa. And then if you look at the temperature increase of 2.4 as a global average, we are talking of 3.6 for Africa. Now, for a continent that is so exposed to global warming because of its location on the map, on the globe, and because of so many other factors, it means that food production on the continent would be severely affected by climate change and climate impact. I should just mention quickly that the Paris target, which has been celebrated around the world, are actually very anachronistic. You say 1.5 degrees as a lower measure, then two well below 2. Now just think about it. What is well below 2 if it's not less than 1.5? So the target of 2 degrees or 1.5, well below 2 is far, I mean, it can be a higher target compared to 1.5. Now, the 6th report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released in August 2021, indicated that Africa is online for very harsh climate realities. Number one is that sea level rise around the continent will continue. It's not likely going to slow down or to stop. And then there's going to be more droughts and more floods. There's going to be increased desertification on the continent. There's going to be increased salinization and acidification of the ocean, increase in the temperatures of the ocean around the continent. All this means very frequent weather events and catastrophic impacts on the continent. Now, the conference COP26 did not appear to take cognizance of all these facts that are placed on the table by the agency of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, neither even in the discussions in the debates that we had. It was like these facts were just put on the shelf. And then countries went ahead to negotiate how to avoid climate action. We had more of nations making pledges for achievement of net zero. The EU promised to achieve net zero by 2050. Many countries pledged to reach the same by 2050 or 2060. India pledged to reach the net zero by 2070. And my country, Nigeria, pledged to reach net zero by 2060. What net zero temperature carbon emission level means actually is that nobody's going to stop emission. They're not going to even slow down emission, but they're going to find ways of mitigating or capturing equivalent measures of the carbon that they are emitting. So in other words, the net zero argument is all about carbon offsetting. So it doesn't tackle the climate problem, but it makes it easy for fossil industries to go ahead and keep on polluting, and for countries who don't want to change from the current pattern of development to just continue to develop that way, continue to produce in that paradigm, and continue to waste resources through wasteful consumption. Now, my country, Nigeria, is already experiencing very direct impacts of global warming, including water stress, especially in the Sahelian northern part of the country, where we have one of the biggest freshwater, we used to have one of the biggest freshwater lakes on the continent of Africa. It's called Lake Chad at northeastern Nigeria. Now that lake has lost about 90% of the volume it had in the early 1960s. What this has meant has been displacement of pastoralists who depend on the lake for watering their camels or cattle and ram and so on and so forth. And then this has also led to displacement of fisher folks and disrupted food production generally in the area that was once a food basket for Nigeria. Now, the displacement of fishers and pastoralists has meant conflict with farmers in other parts of the country. And so when you hear about conflict, violent conflicts in parts of Nigeria, it's not mainly about religious conflict. In fact, I think that this has been clearly seen not to be the case. That religion could be used as an excuse of the climate impact, displacing people's livelihoods, displacing people from where they could have natural resources that would help them to carry on living. And so we're having, when you look at the Atlantic coastline of Nigeria, we have some parts that are naturally subsiding, but then with increased sea level rise, we're having massive land loss due to coastal erosion. When you combine this with the levels of oil spills that we experience in the Niger Delta, we're having a very horrible situation. Water stress in the north, displacement of pastoralists, sea level rise in the south, loss of agricultural land, pollution from the oil sector. All these are disastrous combinations of what we're seeing. So across the continent of Africa, we are seeing massive sea grabs by way of the so-called blue economy, which basically aims to exploit the ocean through extractive activities, thereby disrupting local livelihoods. You may have heard about the struggle in South Africa against seismic activities by Shell Oil Company trying to explore to look for fossil fuel resources along the coastal waters of South Africa. By the fisher folks came together with environmentalists to challenge the seismic activities in the coastal water of South Africa and managed to get a court order stopping that activity for now. Now in East Africa, we're having, there's a massive East African crude oil pipeline that's being to be built from Uganda to Tanzania, about 1,400 kilometers long. It's carrying very waxy crude that have to be heated about 10 times along the route between Uganda and Tanzania. Now, this pipeline is passing through the southwestern border of Lake Victoria, the biggest freshwater lake on the continent, whose watershed supports livelihoods of about 40 million farmers. And so if you have a leakage in that pipeline or some other environmental accidents, you can imagine the disruption that this will bring to farming, to fishing, to pastoralist activities, and to the entire economy of regions on the continent. So the COP26 looked at mainly focus on net carbon arguments, which is nothing, which doesn't address global warming. And then it had other issues clearly that I would say did not play towards helping our farmers. And this includes the fact that the COP itself was very exclusionary, which is something that we can talk about also.
Thank you so much, Nnimmo. That was a really comprehensive overview of what the failure of the climate talk process and the failure to meaningfully take on the oil industry means in real terms. And I wanted to dig a bit more into how and why the climate talks are failing to demand the action needed. And some of that may be who is or isn't in the room where decisions are being made. And Nnimmo, in the UN climate talks in Copenhagen in 2009 that you mentioned, I believe that despite being accredited, you were actually physically escorted out of a session for speaking out for communities on the front line. Things were bad then, but COP26 in Glasgow was recently recrowned the most exclusionary of all the other climate talk meetings. So how has this exclusion, from your perspective, played out in terms of marginalizing voices from Africa in the negotiations? And what were the material outcomes of these decisions? Importantly, sort of, you mentioned a little bit about net zero and the fact that this isn't a real solution. What other kinds of so-called solutions are being pushed, and what vision for the future is emerging from this, particularly for agriculture?
Right. Well, I'm happy you brought up the Copenhagen incident in which I was locked out of the conference after being accredited and after attending for a few days. It happened to me. Of course, it happened to other activists who were also pushed out. But I think the major reason I was kicked out of that conference for some days was because we're very strong in the campaign that the world should take cognizance of the fact that any temperature target that is above 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial level was aimed at killing Africa. And so we had this campaign again, don't kill Africa, do what you can do to protect Africa. And the lead negotiator for Africa, Ambassador Lumumba of Sudan, at that conference actually wept at a press conference when the trend was to just shift the temperature target beyond 1 degree Celsius. Now we are here, since 2015, celebrating a target of 1.5. This was unthinkable for us at Copenhagen, but now it's taken as something that is the best scenario we can get. And of course, with countries now permitted to commit to do whatever they feel is convenient for them through the nationally determined contribution, we're seeing a sense in which the world is now saying that climate change is a national crisis and not a global crisis. Because if it's seen as a global crisis, we should, the responsibility for cutting emissions shouldn't be left for countries to decide. It should be determined by science. How much have you contributed historically, and how much are you contributing now, and what you needed to do now so that the world can at least have tolerable temperature increase above pre-industrial level. So that was what happened at that COP in Copenhagen, which was consolidated in Paris, and which Glasgow also took forward without questioning the very basis of the targets or the means of achieving those targets. So now the COP at Copenhagen, at Glasgow, became very exclusionary on the excuse of COVID-19 pandemic, which for countries that were red listed, if delegates came from those countries, they had to be quarantined for some days. And others couldn't just make it at all to the conference. Even those who went through the rigor of expensive tickets, because the deadlines, nobody was sure whether it's going to take place till very late, expensive tickets, expensive processes of getting vaccine and getting all the tests done, and even getting tests done while in Glasgow on a daily basis. So we saw a situation where many negotiators and observers were totally excluded from the conference halls and had to watch proceedings from screens in their rooms. This is something anybody could have done from their home countries if they had the means of hooking going online. So why travel to Glasgow and get to the conference venue only to be restricted to other rooms to watch on the TV screen or computer screens without being able to participate directly in what was going on? Then secondly, some side events were like at least one I took part in, were forced to just speak before cameras in a way without any kind of participation, no audience at all, and whether this wasn't the plan for such side events. And so people were excluded by barriers of technology, by barriers of the COVID restrictions, and all this diminished from the quality of what came out of COP26. Then secondly, for delegates who managed to get, national delegations who managed to get into the halls, they had just 2 seats per nation. And when you have 2 seats per nation, this diminishes the capacity of nations to have access to technical backup that they need during meetings. And this is one of the roles that civil society plays at some of these conferences, where they help to do analysis of situations and scenarios unfolding and help nations with very few delegates to catch up with others that is going on. But while nations had only 2 seats in this particular negotiation hall, the fossil fuel industry, who should be the major target of this conversation, because it's the fossil fuel they extract that's being burnt and that pumps all these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, they had a whopping 503 delegates from about 100 fossil fuel companies at COP26. Now, when you have that level of that number of delegates, was much higher than any national delegation at that conference, and of course a combination of many smaller delegations, you can find the undue influence that this sector had on the outcome, on the negotiation and the outcome of the conference. So the voices of those living in the areas that are most impacted by global warming, who are demanding real climate action, was greatly diminished, were shut out from the conference. And the outcome was a lot of hot air pledges that are neither here nor there, more net zero pledges. And in fact, I should mention here that one of the foundational bases of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is justice. And that is captured in what is known as Common but Differentiated Responsibilities Principle. But if you look at the Glasgow Climate Pact, the outcome of the COP26, one of the lines in that document presents climate justice as something that is only important to some countries. I mean, to me, that breaks my heart. That's really sad, that a major component, a major principle of the convention could now be regarded as something that is only important to some countries and to some people. There's no wonder the whole negotiation is taken as just a venue for avoiding action. And the impact on agriculture is massive, because as we know, agriculture depends largely on what happens, the climate variabilities. They affect everything about agriculture. Now, agriculture has not always had much mention during the Conference of Parties, but during COP26, there was a lot of talk about agriculture, one of which was a relaunch of what United States and United Arab Emirates pioneered, the AIM4C, Agricultural Innovation Mission for Climate. That's what it's termed. And it's something supported by agribusiness and philanthrocapitalists. And the whole idea is actually to digitalize agriculture, where there would be systems that would be able to measure the quantity of carbon in the soil, nutrients in the soil, and you can actually do agriculture remotely. Perhaps you can do farming without farmers. Because machines could take over, robots could take over, or drones could know which soil needs what seed at what depth, and all this kind of digital system that would actually also make agriculture a tool for carbon trading. Because people could now be farming carbon rather than farming crops for food that we need desperately in the world today. Then one other thing about agriculture that has been coming on regularly in climate negotiations and conversation is the so-called climate smart agriculture. Now, everybody likes it. I mean, when you hear climate smart agriculture, it sounds beautiful. Who doesn't want agriculture to be climate smart? But the truth is that when this is mentioned, the tendency is to think about agriculture that depends on genetically modified varieties of crops and other species, whereas it ought to be. Already we have indigenous species in the desert regions, in Sahelian regions, and in other areas of the world that are already adapted through hundreds of years of cultivation and selection by indigenous farmers. And these are truly smart, climate smart species. But if you bring in species that are developed in laboratories, genetically engineered varieties, you're going to bring about biodiversity erosion, and you're going to wipe out native species by either cross-pollination and some other pushes, some other factors, and this would not be climate smart at all. the COVID-19 constraints goes beyond, I should just mention, beyond what happens at the Conference of Parties on climate change. It also affects the Conference of Parties on the Convention on Biological Diversity. The last meeting was in October 2021, and the next, the preparatory meeting before the final session was to hold in January 2022. But this has been shifted again to March and may even be shifted again. But the thing about this is that in the October meeting, which took place in one single day, 195 nation states and European Union resolved to protect 30% of the planet, to designate 30% of the entire landmass of the planet for conservation, and then to restore another 20% by 2030. Now, what this means that while it sounds very nice and innocent, many indigenous groups have shown that they have genuine reason to be afraid that this could lead to massive, the biggest land grab scheme in the history of the planet. And they are afraid of violent eviction and dispossession and dislocation from the ecosystem that they have been protecting for decades. One group, the Survival International, described this 30 by 30 principle or proposal as the biggest land grab in the history of humanity. And so we're having all this, the COVID provides the excuse for things we put behind shields, and for those who are most impacted, farmers who are most impacted, indigenous people from their territories, fisher folks, pastoralists, are put at a great disadvantage, just because this is a cover that everybody generally accept can be erected as a barrier for, therefore postponing the real action that we need to defend our biodiversity, defend our farming, and indeed enthrone real farming as this conference promotes.
Thank you so much, Nnimmo. You've done such a great job of outlining to us what sort of future corporations and the state that enable them have in store for us through climate smart agriculture, through an emphasis on carbon farming. And I think what is also telling, and you kind of hinted at that at the end, is the solutions that aren't being discussed, like agroecology. And the UN in previous reports have said that agroecology approaches should be the core of our climate response, but this is being buried and erased by these platforms and initiatives that are being led by corporations, providing so-called solutions for agriculture that instead emphasize tech and GMO, because there's no profit for them in agroecology. I'd like us to sort of spend a bit more time about talking about the world that we want and the world that we know we need. So could you talk a little bit about what climate justice means in the context for agriculture a bit more, and about what is the vision of the world that we should be aiming for? What is the future that we should be trying to build, and the solutions that we should be trying to push on the ground?
As I said earlier, most times at these conferences, climate change conferences, agriculture is always sidelined, and very little attention is paid to it as a solution. It's always elevated as a problem, but not a solution. But we do know, as you rightly mentioned, that there are some versions, some types of agriculture that are actually key to solving the climate crisis. But climate justice, on the whole, just means that those who contributed most to the crisis should also be responsible in doing the most to tackle it. That was the principle of the Common but Differentiated Responsibilities and Respective Capacities. When you look historically at who has taken up the carbon budget, who has taken up the space that we can safely have greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, you find that you can actually put your fingers on which countries and which regions are responsible for this. And also when we measure temperature increases, or using pre-industrial level as a benchmark, we also know who has contributed to pollution through these processes. So climate justice means, as I said, those who contributed the most should do the most. But unfortunately, what we see is that those who are most responsible for global warming are also the ones who control the levers of decision-making in multilateral spaces, and they use these levers to block or reverse actions to reject any notion of responsibility for global warming, any notion of historical responsibility or accountability is pushed away offhand. And this is very unfortunate because it's totally unjust for that to happen. And because this kind of, the real solutions are waved off due to corporate interests, due to colonial and imperial interests, we find that we always tend towards the false solutions, unfortunately. Now, as I mentioned again, when sectors make a significant contribution to global warming are discussed, agriculture is always considered or presented as one of these. But the fact is that it's not agriculture generally that is responsible. It's a type of agriculture that contributes the most to global warming, and that is a type of agriculture that depends on fossil fuel resources. And we talk about industrial, chemical-based, fossil fuel-based agriculture, which grabs much land, causes land use conversion, destroys forests, and of course displaces local communities to grab these lands and territories. So unfortunately, again, those who are most affected by climate crisis also happen to be the ones who have the burden of climate action through carbon offsetting and through all kinds of proposals and schemes being drawn up by United Nations framework systems, including notions like reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Now, to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation is a great idea. Everybody should accept it. But when you do this by claiming that you know how much carbon is in a particular tree, on a particular forest, and when you accept a plantation to be something as a forest, then we completely miss it. We can't be looking at trees as carbon stocks. We should be looking at trees as complex ecosystems, as living ecosystems that support our food production efforts, support our life in all ramifications. But the good thing is that agriculture that can help solve the climate problem, primarily agroecology, is also a solution. So farmers who practice this kind of agriculture have the solution, and they have a clear vision for the future. And the vision for the future, as I see it, one is to decolonize agriculture, and then the real farmers should have the powers to chart the way forward, not industrial conglomerates who consolidate colonial monoculture, plantation, and industrial patterns of agriculture. We need to see farmers who are hands-on, who are working in line with nature, who drive policies that focus on, that support small-scale farmers who use 30% of global resources and feed about 70% of the population, and not the reverse. So the mode of production depends heavily on climatic conditions. Unpredictable variations do have capacity to destabilize productivity. And so we need to listen to these farmers who are actually working with nature and whose works help to maintain the health of the soil, which is what agroecology does mostly, to ensure that the soil is healthy. When the soil is healthy, then of course food production becomes much more on course to be at the levels that farmers can say, yes, we got good yield, and people can be sure of safe and good quality food in quantities that are needed. This is also what we support pastoralists, because then also when the soil is healthy, they can have fodder for their animals, rather than depending on feed that depends on production of grains, which leads to deforestation and creates other problems. Now, in 2008, after 3 years of research, multilateral complex research by a process that was called the International Assessment of Agricultural Science and Technology for Development. In 2008, they produced a report which examined the multifunctional nature of agriculture for social, environmental, and economic sustainability. And one of the conclusions was that the agriculture that works with nature is what would bring about food security in the world in the future. In other words, if nations are to invest in agriculture, investment should be in food production, in crop production, in animal production that works in sync with nature, and not the ones that that tends to think that they know, it knows better than nature, and that they can actually make nature more efficient rather than working in a way that makes, that just supports the way and works in harmony with nature. And so what we need, what I believe we need now is not just, we talk about just transition in terms of energy, moving from fossil fuels to renewable energy. Of course, that is very essential. But we also need just transition in agriculture, moving from the energy-intensive agriculture to, as I said earlier, a more agroecology, a more nature-based food production system that supports production of food that is natural, that depends on indigenous species, native species, and that supports farmers without having to expose them to debt and to all kinds of manipulations, without having to tie them to the shoestrings or economic strings of seed companies and chemical companies who are the ones controlling the agricultural system currently in the world today. So we need to support a system where the shift from industrial to a more natural system of production does not mean a loss of jobs for farmers, for farm workers, but will support also the transition of those who are working currently in industrial farming to be able to work in agroecological systems. And of course, agroecology doesn't just mean small scale farming, it means upscale. It means it can be upscale to any level without being destructive to nature, to natural ways of getting things done. So agroecology is certainly the way forward. It's not only the way forward for having healthy soils and producing food that takes care of our food needs in a way that responds to food sovereignty, that we produce the food that we need in the manner we want, food that is in line with our culture, food that aids our celebrations of life, our social life, our spirituality, but would also support those who are working in the food production sector. So that should guide our vision for the world. And this should help us to decolonize a system of plantation agriculture that is continuously disrupting our biodiversity, disrupting communities, and creating conflict around the world.
Thank you so much, Nnimmo. That's a really inspiring vision that we should be working towards. And I think my next question, and my final question before we move on to questions from the participants, is what do we need to do to get to that vision? What needs to happen at the various decision-making fora, like the climate talks? What can we do to push for that? And also, I feel like a lot of times citizens in the global north don't realize the power that they have and maybe the responsibility they have to push their own governments to support activists and support countries in the global south. So how can we work together across the global north and the global south to get there?
Well, I think you've really hit the nail on the head. This is the way forward. Farmers of the world must unite. This is a time for farmers in the global north and the farmers in the global south to come together to share ideas. We have platform for this to happen, for example, in the La Via Campesina, but we need to build other bridges so that farmers can share experiences, share vision, share ways of doing things that work with nature. And then, of course, we can learn a lot from young people. Young people are breaking the barriers between the way activism is done in the global north and the way it's done in the global south. I can see a coming together of forces of young people who are saying, what is the use for education if there's no planet for me to survive on? If you're setting the planet on fire, what are you talking about net zero by 2050? Would there be human beings on the planet by 2050? Or would there be, how many people will survive by that time? And so young people are coming together, sharing ideas, and really supporting one another. And we need to see the adults need to key into this. We need to learn from young people, come together, farmers should come together to work together. And one of the key things, we need a conference of parties, the discussions, either in the CBD or at the Convention of Biodiversity or in the Climate Convention, as this platforms continue to shift away from real action from the people, from farmers, from the needs of our people, then we should actually begin to delegitimize these kind of processes and overturn them and set up a system that actually listens to the voice of the people. When the Copenhagen conference failed in 2009, the very next year, the government of Bolivia convened and hosted the People's Summit on Climate Change and the Right of Mother Earth. And there were so many countries represented, and within just a few days, there were very clear-cut decisions, including the Universal Declaration of the Right of Mother Earth, which gives responsibilities to humans on how not to disrupt the natural cycles of nature and how to not to do things that are wasteful and destructive, like continuous warfare, overconsumption, and so on and so forth. And so if we have people's conferences of climate conferences that become the universal, they become the platform for decision-making, and we get our countries in our various nations to listen to what the people say, to actually be servants of the people as they're elected to be, and then we have a chance of bringing the people's vision into action. Because as long as we cede our sovereignty, yield our sovereignty to politicians whose vision is just 4 years in office, and then they push action to the end of the century when they will no longer be around, and when they don't really care what happens on the planet, then the system is going to continue to be one of false solutions continuously, like net zero, false solution like, as I mentioned, carbon offsetting, carbon trading, which just means continue to pollute, continue to do things as in the pattern that you've been doing, and not shift, not transit to a way that is much more in harmony with nature. And so we need to work together to force a transition away, not just from fossil fuels, but to recover our fisheries. If fossil fuel extraction is stopped in our waters, in the ocean, coastal, continental shelves, in the Gulf of Guinea, Gulf of Mexico, in all the other territories, North Sea, we're going to open up much more areas for fisheries. And the fisheries will all recover because there'll be less pollution. And then, of course, farmers in the global north and global south have to really take on seed sovereignty as a critical platform for campaigns, building of seed banks in the global north and the global south, protecting indigenous seeds, and overturning this kind of uniform seed laws that more or less give authority to seed companies to control the seed destiny of nations, especially in Africa. This is what we're seeing. There's a trend in which nations are signing up to laws that are not indigenous, they don't address the needs of the farmers in our countries, but are really pandering to the needs of colonial seed companies who want to control the kind of seeds and reduce the biodiversity on the continent and reduce the food crops. In the past, we had thousands of varieties of food crop, but now we're reduced to rice, beans, varieties of yams, and a few other things, which is really very sad indeed. So we need to recognize the fact that, and I said this earlier, that agriculture is not to blame for global warming. It's a variety of agriculture. And then agroecology is the way forward to cool the planet and give us a better food system. So we need to see more exchanges between farmers in the global north and the global south, and of course, across regions in the various parts of the world. There's a lot of wisdom, a lot of knowledge, and a lot of experience that have been gained over the years. And unless we have this kind of exchanges, we may just lose the knowledge that has been piled up over the centuries. So we need to build solidarity, working to secure access to indigenous seeds, improving practices, exposing those who are working to disrupt real farming, including those who are promoting land grabs, farmers' debts, promoting genetically engineered crops, whether the old GMOs or gene editing, the new ones that are not even being regulated, and trade regimes that force farmers to buy seeds every year rather than saving their seeds. We need to also tackle seeds that give subsidies to these seed companies and favor industrial farming over local farming. So we have the platform, many things we need to share together, and then we can all move together to rescue our farming and have real farming back on the pedestal.
Thank you, Nnimmo. That was really inspiring. And I think that gives us a lot of food for thought. We're now going to move into the question and answer section. And there's some really excellent questions coming through. And I'm going to pick on a couple that kind of relate to what you were just saying about what we need to, the solidarity going forward. So we've got a great question from D Woods about what solidarity strategies do farmers and climate justice activists have in Africa to challenge these false solutions? And how can African heritage people in the diaspora support?
That's an excellent question. Yes, there are many platforms on the continent right now that are working towards ensuring that although we have different realities, the continent is very diverse and there are many different realities in various zones, but to come together to build solidarity and really strengthen and raise the voice of the continent, voices from the continent at the negotiation. We have African Climate Justice Conveners Group that is really doing very deep grassroots work that brings in not just climate activists or environmentalists, but you have farmers, you have pastoralists, you have fisher folks, you have environmentalists, you have everyone from various sectors working together. And you have the African Food Sovereignty Alliance, which is also considered a lot in pushing agriculture as a solution. You have the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, PACJA. So you have so many platforms, and there are other platforms that are under construction even as we speak. And Africa, there are many clear alternatives, which is the alternatives we're talking about, alternatives that takes care of the interests of majority farmers on the continent. We want a situation where people in the diaspora can help by telling the stories, can also help by propagating the fact that we are losing our food sovereignty at a very rapid rate because of politicians who are not questioning the kind of seeds and the kind of processes that are being pushed onto the continent by corporate interests that somehow tend to always have the ear of politicians.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Nnimmo. So here's a question from Anne-Marie Meyer. What do you think would be a good way to present indigenous African farmers as a solution to climate change problems? How to show an alternative to corporate agriculture?
Excellent question. I think this is one this is what the African Food Sovereignty Alliance has been doing continuously. Getting the stories from the grassroots, from the farmers, getting the techniques developed by local people, and we need to tell the stories. We have to break into the media, and activists and farmers in the global north have the potential of opening up the space, getting the media in the global north to look at what farmers are doing in Africa. I was astonished when I spent some years ago in Burkina Faso in the Sahel with a man, Yakuba Sawadogo. You can find about him, the man who stopped the desert, who has been able to stop desertification in the Sahel in Burkina Faso and grew a forest in the Sahel. So such a thick forest that the government was thinking about how to thin out the forest it was creating. And so there are technology, local technologies, local ideas that farmers are using to grow crops in very difficult circumstances. And this needs to be propagated and shared. The problem is that a lot of what is going on the continent, the spotlight is very limited on what is going on there.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and we need to increase that spotlight, don't we? And maybe that's something that we could do in solidarity. So we have this another question actually from Anne-Marie about the Alliance for the Green Revolution for Africa. And she's noting that it's doing the opposite of what you're proposing. So how are we going to challenge them and demonstrate an alternative? So I guess it's challenging a specific initiative.
Yeah, well, AGRA, the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, is just an idea that was wrongly conceived to start with. It's about people who believe that something that worked in the past will work in the future. I mean, I think that worked in the past that will work in the future, but the Green Revolution itself failed. It didn't work in Asia, it didn't work in Latin America. It worked for a period of time, but grossly damaged the soils. We see examples of this in India, in other countries that has always held up as the best examples and why we need Green Revolution in Africa. What Africa needs is food sovereignty, it needs support for local farmers who are working with nature. Not the Green Revolution is promoting genetically engineered agriculture, promoting dependence on artificial seeds. And for the years of investment through governments and agencies, the outcome has been so abysmal. So what we can all do, wherever we are located, is to look at the outcome of the investment in this alliance by philanthropic capitalists who believe they know better than the farmers in Africa, and who believe that imported ideas are always better. Very colonial approaches to agriculture. So that is just to expose that, and then to promote what is being done locally that is producing much more than what Agra could ever do.
We have a very general question here about just the fact that people in the West don't seem to understand the gravity of the situation. I mean, I think we can maybe debate whether that's the case or not, but how do we sort of like raise awareness? I guess this is the case of like building more solidarity in the global North. Like, how do we build awareness of the gravity of the situation with them?
As Radhi said, this question can be asked about virtually every sector of human activities on the continent. Just like I come from the Niger Delta in Nigeria, where we have massive oil pollution going on at every moment in time. Now, the focus that the world put on the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico cannot be compared to what is going on a daily basis, the ecocide that we live with in Niger Delta. When there was a shipwreck that polluted in Mauritius early last year, the focus on it was so interesting. I was getting calls from all over the world. How can we support the people? I mean, I was happy about that. But then we don't really need to wait for disasters before we share our stories. And this is where groups and individuals on the continent are doing the best they can to get the stories to be told, to document processes and systems that are working, and to expose the fact that ideas that don't have buy-in, that are disrupting what have been proven to work, are not helpful at all. And so I think we all have to, permit me to say this, to be open to learning. We have to come to the level that we want to learn, intentionally learning from one another, sharing our stories. I can say this over and over again. We need to hear each other. As long as we don't hear one another, we are going to always depend so much on the dominant stories, which is what is coming from the multilateral processes, the same processes that disrupted our economy, disrupted our food processes through structural adjustment programs, through trade regimes, and of course, and so we have to, and this is why before COP26 occurred, some groups in Africa held counter COPs. They were having counter COPs. Now that was, to me, experimental. Now we have to have this on a bigger scale, where even if it's outside the venue of the meeting, like the next COP is coming up in Egypt, if you have a counter COP in Egypt itself, if that is possible, considering the political situation there, then that could, to a large extent, help to legitimize the official platforms. And so we really need to find creative ways of making this happen.
That's really great, Nnimmo. And I think you also answered Helena Paul's question about how do we delegitimize and create parallel processes. So you kind of addressed that in your final answer. So we've come to the end of the questions from the audience. And I just wanted to say a massive thanks to you for all of your thoughts and your interventions today. Really a lot for us to think about, and a lot for us, and I'm sure there are many people on the call who are involved in organizing in their own communities around agriculture, who can think about how to, broaden and deepen that solidarity, across different communities. So maybe we could just round off this session. Firstly, I want to thank everyone who turned up today. Thank the people who helped with the moderation, the tech behind the scenes, and allow Nnimmo to just close out with a sort of closing statement on maybe summarizing some of the things that you would like us to really focus on as a result of the session.
Thank you so much, Gaya. And let me also thank all participants who have signed up and who have been part of this conversation. as they say, let the conversation continue beyond this panel. I'm sure it will also echo in some other panels. In closing, I would like to emphasize the fact that we should find ways of ensuring that agriculture and real farming takes central place in discussions on climate change and in the negotiations. And we can make this happen by pushing this at our national levels and regional levels. If we make this very strong at national levels, then it's going to show up stronger in the multilateral space. And then we should also completely reject this so-called voluntary emissions reduction regime, which is not leading anywhere good. It's taking us to catastrophic global warming. Nations cannot be left to do as they please. And we also have to reject the so-called net zero proposal being made by every nation. And they're just making this proposal because it's easy to make. So I'm going to achieve this in 2050, in the year 2070, and so on and so forth, because the measurement is somewhere down in the future, and they won't be held to account for that. And then we shouldn't allow the pandemic to be a tool that is used to divide us, to exclude people from negotiations. And we have to devise ways of making those negotiations more inclusive to ensure that everybody is at the table and all voices that should be heard are heard. That's a work for all of us to do, to find how can we make this happen? Are we going to have big clusters and decentralized negotiations, or what are we going to do? Then we need to also call for a just transition in the agricultural sector, not just in the energy sector, because there are a lot of farmers working in the industrial agricultural sector who cannot just be thrown into the field, thrown off into the job market. We need to find ways of getting them to be reintegrated and retrained to be able to work in ways that don't depend on chemical fertilizers, chemical pesticides and herbicides, and work on more natural ways of food production and regain a balance and contribution and connection to nature. And so what I'm saying in conclusion is that it's a good time for human beings to return to a common sense approach to problem solving. And in the case of global warming, the common sense is don't create the problem in the first place. Leave the fossil fuels in the ground. As we always say, keep the oil in the soil and leave the coal in the hole. We can't eat our cake and have it. And we don't need that cake at all. And so we don't need the fossil fuels. Let's keep them where nature kept them. And let's work with nature. And nature, as we treat nature kindly, Mother Earth is always willing to take all of us. And above all, whatever you do, let's stand together. Farmers, unite. Let's build solidarity and bridges across our regions. Thank you.